Welcome. I'm April Fenton, and today I will be debunking the fireworks video from the Schoolhouse Rock series of educational animated music videos that ran between Saturday morning cartoons in the 70s and 80s when I was a very young child. The videos covered learning concepts like science and space, parts of speech, and American history. Many a Generation Xer learned a lot about history from Schoolhouse Rock, but these little cartoon videos were not always historically correct because they were there only to get basic information across so little kids could understand. Your assignment is to open the link below in a new window and then follow the directions I've written in the description box for this video. Let's begin. There's a very, very important point to make here. We need to remember that the 4th of July was not concretely the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. The 2nd of July was when the final draft of the Declaration was presented to the Continental Congress, and there are some sources that state some congressmen signed on the 4th, but that there was a sudden swarm of horseflies that filled the hall, prompting everyone to vacate the premises. Some of us take for granted that modern light fabrics were not available then, and these very proper gentlemen were clothed in heavy woolen suits and tight cravats, and some wore very thick ornate wigs. There was no air conditioning. It was the height of summer in a humid, stinky city without modern sanitation. So opening the windows was the only way to ventilate the space. So enter the swarm. Trumbull's famous painting that actually shows up on our $2 bill is just wrong. It's just a representation of the idea that everyone was there and everyone was ready to sign immediately. Some signers dawdled a few days, some up to a week, according to some sources. And there was a key member of Congress who left altogether, but we'll get to him in a little bit. Now you can resume the fireworks video and wait till the lyrics to tell you to pause and return to this video. Pause. Okay, this statement makes it seem like all colonists were upset about the political climate of the period. This simply wasn't true, as there were loads of folks who wanted to remain British subjects for many different reasons, mostly because they relied heavily on the income brought in by the trade with England. Lots of people, particularly those involved in pacifist religious groups like Quakers, for example, simply didn't want any sort of armed conflict or just wanted to be left in peace to do their own thing, which in hindsight is a perfect reason to strive for freedom, I believe. In response, some patriots felt, if you're not with us, you're against us, and they destroyed property and livelihoods of many of these folks, whether they were supportive of the Tories or not. Of utmost importance here, however, is that liberty does not mean depriving others of theirs, but unruly mobs just don't often see reason. Speaking of reason, we'll pause here. Most freedom-loving folks were all for this, but remember, there were a lot of people who claimed personal liberty was essential to them, but were still okay with subjugating others. Let that process for a second if you'd like. A lot of these people held slaves and used despicable social constructs of race to make themselves feel better about owning human beings. Some others were opposed to slavery, but promoted elimination of Native Americans from what they now considered their land. Again, that's taking away others' liberty and rights. And still there were colonial women who had very few rights, but maybe they saw the Declaration of Independence as a hope for a better tomorrow. I think to properly examine the concept of freedom as it has to do with the Declaration, we need to remember just who that freedom was intended for. You should think about this in depth from time to time, especially as you cast election ballots. In voting for initiatives or politicians, what are the consequences? Am I potentially taking away someone else's rights if I vote one way or another? Whose rights are more important? People, lands, corporations? Let's pause here and see some more fireworks. Okay, this is the biggest mistake the video makes by far, and not just in one way. First and foremost, Philip Livingston had nothing to do with the actual drafting of the Declaration. It was a completely different guy, Robert Livingston, who was the gentleman I mentioned before, who had left the Congress to go take care of organizing the militia in his home state of New York when it came time to sign the very document he supposedly helped to write. Well, we know now that that's wrong too, since historians have pieced together the puzzle that shows us Thomas Jefferson wrote the thing all by himself. Franklin didn't write it because he was in the throes of some serious gout pain. Adams didn't write it. He was thought of as very annoying and self-righteous by most of Congress, and he knew it, which was why he got Jefferson in for the job. Roger Sherman didn't write it, but he was placed on the committee because he was basically the opposite of John Adams. Everyone really liked him. He was a good speaker, and he was from Connecticut, meaning that he further represented New England, which was really the heart of conflict. And he was really well versed in law. Sherman was probably consulted by Jefferson a few times as to how properly to phrase things in a legal sense. Sherman was trusted to give honest opinions, and he certainly knew what he was talking about. Robert Livingston, on the other hand, was simply seated on the committee because they needed a conservative from New York, a colony that was really unsure whether or not it even wanted to separate from Britain. New York City was a major Tory stronghold, as it was so dependent on British trade. The people who sent him to represent New York didn't even give him permission to approve of the thing that he was on the committee to invent. Livingston was basically just there because he'd made a big stink about how important it was for the middle colonies to be symbolically represented in the drafting, to provide a more united front. And he suggested that he was just the right man for the job. Philip Livingston, on the other hand, was there to sign the Declaration and arguably gets slightly more credit as a founding father because of that. We pause here. The word happiness actually doesn't mean today what it meant in 1776. Language often changes to suit changes in culture. To be happy in the 18th century meant to live comfortably. A little money in savings, a decent home, good employment, maybe some education. The American concept of happiness was an offshoot of the English structure of social class. And furthermore, it's important to note that Jefferson didn't say that anyone was guaranteed happiness, just the chance under the law to pursue it. Let's pause. This should probably read when King George and some members of Parliament heard the news. The English people really didn't give a crumpet about what was happening in North America unless they had a son or brother or sweetheart in the military, or they deeply relied on some natural resource from the colonies for their own pursuit of happiness. They were much more concerned about conflict elsewhere. India, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Africa were all places in which the British Empire held much more valuable territory. These places had vastly greater resources than North America. We'll pause here. Ooh, dig that crazy John Hancock. But there was a reason he, well, put his John Hancock there. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman in the import-export trade, he was a notorious smuggler. One of the big reasons a lot of these taxes were levied on the colonists was to combat the smuggling of goods that could have brought in necessary income to cover debts accrued in the 7 Years' War. But just like a lot of businessmen today, he did everything he could get away with to not pay his fair share. Hancock was constantly pursued by tax collectors in Boston and eventually lost a significant sum to them by royal decree. If you notice, several of the grievances Jefferson outlined in the Declaration have to do with the protection of trade and the ships that carried goods. Piracy and privateering were outrageous at this time, and Hancock felt his business, smuggling, wasn't being adequately protected. Anyway, he wanted the king to see his name from across the ocean in a figurative sense. Pause. Unalienable? Unalienable? Let's just chalk that up to 18th century pre-Webster's dictionary Jeffersonese. Once more we pause. Well, I love me some good fireworks too. And I love this country and I love its history. Thank you.